This book aims to present an ethical system that arises from the interaction of two ethical laws: Eleutherianism, a form of deontology, and Hermenism, a form of consequentialism. My critique of the principle of the will of Kantian deontology creates Eleutherianism. The interaction between the metaphysics of intuition and the definition of the good will creates Hermenism. It is a consequentialism that serves to be the judge of morality, while Eleutherianism serves as the guide. ELH, or Eleutherian Hermenism, is the abbreviation of the two laws' implications and interactions. This is created with the knowledge of what is good from the judge morality and of our duties from the guide morality. The judge informs the guide, and the guide informs the judge in a learning process until we have mapped out the best practices for how to achieve morality from the good will. Necessary definitions for clarity. Here are some definitions of terms I use in the rest of the book. A first-order duty is defined as the immediate choice an actor makes in setting themselves up with a moral choice. This is character. It is the activity of duty of the subject. The second-order duty is the construction of the moral space to create the best outcome morally through both restricted choice and freedom. These are also the agent-based constructions of duty. This is done by creating a space where it is easier to get the best outcome. It is also the agent's influence on a subject, the logistics of morality. Amicology, or the theory of the second-order space, is the container of this construction. The third-order duty is the construction of the moral spaces and the interaction between spaces. This is the ideology of society or the construction of the laws of the nation-state. The fourth-order duty is the construction of the moral space between ideologies or the meta-ideology of interactions between any two differing ideologies. The fourth-order duty can be anything from the duty of the federal government to the states and vice versa, or the duty between religions or creeds that differ on fundamental grounds. History is defined as the past circumstances of the reality that is under consideration for the decisions of the adjudicatory process of the good will. The actual adjudicatory process will come later in the book. Subjective causes are anything that uses a will to cause something. The subjective cause of my writing is my will to write. Objective causes are the material reality that causes me to have an opportunity to cause something. An objective cause for my writing is my computer. Immediate forms of attribution are things that take credit for actions of the first order. The purchase of an item has an immediate form of attribution. It tells us the subjective cause of this was your decision to purchase. The immediate objective cause is the object that allows for something to occur, such as the money that you use to purchase something. Historical forms of attribution is the existence of history as a cause in something. This could be all the influence on the subject of upbringing, mores, society, or anything that comes from history that played a part in providing the objective or subjective cause. These are the causes of the second, third, and fourth order. Description of moral laws. These next three chapters are simply a description of Eleutherianism, Hermenism, and Eleutherian Hermenism as positively constructed moral framework and laws. They aim to provide a shallow understanding of the phenomena of good and metaphysics that I seek to prove in the rest of the book. Hermenism. The judge morality of Hermenism is what decides whether an action is good or not after the action. We take the process of intuitional judgment on whether something is a good, a consequentialism, and seed it with the definition of the good will to discover what is a good result. A seed is a value of morality. All seeds come from the good will. These seeds include justice, freedom, survival, fairness, and any moral value. We take the aim of the good will to do its duty to the subject. Will or abstract good, and then Hermenism tells us whether the aim was accomplished. Take the seed of feeding your own child. We aim to feed our children to keep them alive and healthy. That is why we buy and prepare food for them. This is the result of the aim of the goodwill to feed our children as good itself and so they can do good. The act of feeding them is confirmed scientifically to be moral good, as without food they would die. Poison would kill them. Rotting food would make them sick. Thus, feeding our children food that is nourishing is an action that satisfies the aim of the goodwill. This can get very complicated when we impose higher order duties. A simple heuristic for the Hermanist calculus is essentially, did this action result in a better world or not? If there are actors that have been harmed and actors that have benefited, it seeks to weigh results while also providing cooperative activity that keeps harms from occurring due to second-order restrictions. A simple example of the Hermanist calculus is whether it was beneficial to spend money on food or rent. If you spend it on food, you eat. If you spend it on rent, you continue to have shelter. This example is a case of positional injustice. Both actions result in a better world for yourself, but lead to some harm. There are three types of second-order constrained actions, both being permissible and a good result, one being bound by duty and positional injustice. We see that if the second-order construction of a space fails, it results in a positional injustice, where a bad result must occur no matter what. This is an example of how Hermanism judges social spaces. If you are thrust into a space that forces you to lead to negative results, then it is moral to simply do as much good as you can. Here are some more examples of duty of the first order in the Hermanist calculus. Kill your child as they lied to you about whether they brushed their teeth. We see that this is morally a terrible result for the child and is injustice. The Hermanist calculus takes all the good of your child and sees that the world is better off with them in it. The lie is still punished, but murder in this case is immoral. Forgive someone for hitting your car after they run a red light. This is a question of justice. Forgiveness is as just as moral under Hermanism. It is one of the options of justice. This is morally permissible as long as the person doesn't pose a threat for other people. Justice from the good, Will could see the forgiveness as justice, but then force the driver to take driving classes or even take their driver's license if they pose a threat to the lives of other people, such as if they were drunk, high, or driving recklessly for fun. Engage in taxation for the aim of educating children in the art of pottery. This is a morally permissible action depending on what the taxation results in for the taxed. If the people taxing can't support themselves or their agents, then the taxation is impermissible. If there is more than enough to go around, then the taxation is permitted. Say every adult but you want to teach children pottery, and you impose your will on the society through an authority to tax. This is seen as impermissible with a social organization that respects things such as democracy, but with a republicanism, or social organization that lets you impose. This could be seen as permissible, but bad politics. This leans to the fundamental problem of imposition versus respect of socially organized orders. Justice has long been imposed, for better or worse, on societies as mob justice is a problem with law and democracy. This allowance to impose under the goodwill is something that speaks to who and what system rules. The social orders of ELH can be numerous and with many interwoven parts. Hermanism offers a glimpse into abuses of power for both the ruled subject and the ruler. In a trivial case of whether children should learn pottery, this is often not important. In cases of minority rights, such as a genocide by the majority against the minority, this problem of how to impose and police those that impose is often paramount. So what is Eleutherianism, and how is it different from Kantian deontology? I aim in this section to completely disregard Kant entirely and base Eleutherianism on what I take from Kant as a moral imposition. The justification for Eleutherianism metaphysically comes later in this book. This is just an overview of what Eleutherianism is as a positive construction. The deontology of Eleutherianism is based on our knowledge of what is good from Hermanism and the metaphysics of the invention of good section. Here is Eleutherianism described as a moral law. The method scope critique allows us the formation of aim-based duty assignment, as all aims can be written as a priori principles that the will acts on. With this in mind, we must disregard all of Kant's metaphysics after the construction of the goodwill's definition on which all good is based. It is only this which is definitionally perfect. Eleutherianism is the construction of the assignment of duties with all knowable aims that the actor has when performing the action. It is a guide morality, or a law, that informs us what is moral before we perform the action. This duty-based assignment of what is good is done through the aims-based Eleutherian calculus. What is the best practice, most moral world, or duty that I am acting on? This happens with a deontology with the theory of good from Hermanism. The process of the EL calculus is essentially, does this action result in a more moral world? This can get quite complex in circumstances, but the process is demonstrated in these examples. Should I cut down a tree? The EL calculus takes all duties into account. The duty to the world, the tree and property versus the duty to yourself, your will, and what you aim to use the tree for. If there is no need to cut down the tree, or there is a less moral world if you cut down the tree, then it is not justified. If you aim to make the tree into paper, then we inspect to see if the tree is necessary for a more moral world. This paper would add utility, but cutting down the tree would harm the ecology of the world. If the world is in desperate need of trees, then we should use other forms of technology to maintain the tree in the world. This demonstrates the process by which EL adapts to moral circumstances to achieve a moral result. The EL calculus is what is used to create a heuristic-based decision-making process that is no means perfect, but will allow for moral guidance. What our duties are comes from Hermanism. The principal difference between Kant's deontology and Eleutherinianism is the adjudication between human ends. It seeks to determine which is moral, not from results, but from duties, rights, and justice. We see that when humanity is at conflict, there is no guidance as to who the good will sides with Kantian deontology. This adjudication process is the essential problem with Kant's deontology and what ELH seeks to solve. The conflict between a murderer and a victim is solved easily with ELH adjudicatory process. The heuristic that is used is the heuristic of rights. Should I allow a murderer to kill me? Kant's only moral guidance is that both the murder of the murderer in self-defense and the murder of yourself is immoral to allow. We are then forced into a non-violent solution that is often not practical. The adjudicatory process of EL is the process by which we determine if we are allowed to defend ourselves from murderers. We see that the duty to defend yourself is a real duty, and for the crime of trying to murder under EL, it is permissible to kill in self-defense. The murder of someone is impermissible without good reason, and even then it should be only used in extreme circumstances. EL defends the innocent from the assailant and allows murder in self-defense WC. Eleutherinianism is a deontology. It seeks to inspect what our duties are. A famous aphorism of deontology asks whether we can use extreme means to accomplish our goals. Do the ends justify the means? EL looks to see what are good means to accomplish the aims of the good will. The act of eating meat results in a pleasurable result, your hunger satisfied, but is often immoral because of the means that is used for accomplishing that goal. The slaughter of animals. This is the means-based calculus of deontology. If you can eat something else to satisfy your hunger that doesn't involve cruelty, then you must. If you believe that the only way to keep the world safe from crime is to slaughter all the people who benefit criminals, knowingly or unknowingly, you have failed the means-based calculus of the goodwill. It is this means-based calculus that allows for moral values to take hold from the original appeal of deontology. It is not the satisfaction of the result that makes something permissible, but the satisfaction of both means and ends. Using only Hermanism or Eleutherinianism is problematic as both rely on the other. We need both to develop and perform morality. It is only the use of both that allows for a moral law without problems to be developed. Eleutherian Hermanism is both moral laws taken into account. We see that the moral guidance of both result in a system that is similar to virtue ethics in phenomena of good. EL seeks to be used before activity, H seeks to be used after activity, and ELH seeks to be a learning morality that advances both guide and judge morality to construct a moral agent and world. The iterative process of ELH is when we seek to determine what is the best practice for a certain action or of an imposition itself. It is the way how both laws refine each other and allow for advancement. ELH metaphysically is the knowledge of what is a good result from H and how to achieve a good result from EL. It is the learning of our duties, good, and how we achieve both. The metaphysical portion is composed of the justification of the method of philosophy, the CDM, the creation of EL, the creation of H, and then some of the phenomena of good from these compositions. The creation of EL is the interactions with Kant's definition of activity and the metaphysics of deontology. The creation of H is the metaphysical portion of this consequentialism. There is then the section of the phenomena of good, or my interpretation of how the phenomenal imposition of these two laws' interactions exist in constructions of society and moral phenomena from the good will. The first step in this journey to a physics of morality is the justification of the method of philosophy, which I use to prove Elhian ethics.
Proof of universal definitional good. The definition of good provides the first link in the chain of thought that creates ELH. What does it mean to define good? The need for a priori knowledge of good is the knowledge of good that is the proof by definition. All that is needed to know from the definition of the goodwill is that it aims to respect the good-willed subject. This is the truth of the definition of a priori good. Good being defined as the respect of the good-willed subject. Respect being the aims of the goodwill towards the good-willed subject. Here are some of the main claims of the metaphysics of ELH. The goodwill wills good. Respect of the goodwill is definitionally good. This is true by definition. The goodwill wills good on itself and all other things. This is the process of the goodwill willing good or moral consideration. The process of knowing phenomena from any proof by definition is of this structure. It takes the a priori category of the definition and applies it to any subject that has a will. The evil will is one example which I will bring up in more detail later. It is this knowledge of the a priori category that allows for proof by definitions to be different. The evil will and the good will are different due to the a priori knowledge of evil and good. While the good will respect the subject, the evil will may disrespect it through the a priori knowledge of evil. I call this technique that Kant and I use to extract phenomena of good from the definition of the goodwill the categorical definitional method, or the CDM. Functional epistemology. Truth is defined as it contains itself from definitional truth. Truth is true if it contains its own trueness. In the case of truth, the word itself is a definition. This is always the case because the word itself exists. Something is true from words if it, the phenomena or noumenon sought to be described, contains its own definition. With phenomena, this is from experience of the contained and the container. On the principle of the goodwill. The current interpretation of the principle of the will calls for us to distill the maxim in such a way to obtain the principle on which one acts. It is only this principle of the will that Kant calls to for moral weight. The prohibition of what Kant calls the achievement of the ends disregards that the principle of the will can contain many scopes, each of which are needed to determine moral weight. Cause and effect. In the system of judgment after the action, the method is the effect and the cause. This is the collective perspective. This is a perspective from perfect knowledge. Atomizing. The process of atomizing is both the process of description of activity and the process of assigning culpa. An atom is defined as a component of information that describes the activity. It can be both method and scope, just method and only the effects of the action. Kant's metaphysics. The critique of the principle of the goodwill creates problems in Kant's impositions of tests and formulas. I took aim at his second proposition of morality. All other formulations of Kant fail with this critique of his second proposition of morality. It is based on a linguistic assumption and fails to properly offer a theory of good. Humanity formula refutation. The aim of humanity as an end in itself is, under Elhian theories of good, the same for all things. We aim to do good, and treating humanity as an end in itself is just treating the human subject with moral consideration. We see that this is applied to anything an ELH thing, human or animal. The practical imperative is thus refuted through the positive construction of El-Hyan theories of good, as Kant provides no theory of adjudication when human beings are in conflict. Categorical imperative refutation. We can will no outlawing of methods, as there are always circumstances by which the method may be moral. The end result of El-Hyan outlawing is either the definition of crime as a colonization of circumstances or an understanding of methods as wavum. This is an outlawing of activity as one action with specific circumstances. The outlawing of methods never occurs until it goes through the El-Hyan process of consciousness that creates a better outlawing rather than just categorically. The definition then colonizes circumstances to make it different from categorical language. Thus, Eleutherian Hermenism is the solution to these problems in Kantian deontology. It is the interactions between guide and judge morality. Guide serves judge as the goodwill assigns moral duties, and judge serves guide as providing tactics that better serve duty based on experience. This iterative process is refining the ELH given any situation and solves what are good duties, and how do we do good. On the metaphysics of intuition, what is the consequentialism that serves us the same way Eleutherianism serves deontology? The best way to do this is giving a metaphysic to the process of intuitional judgment. This I call the metaphysics of intuition. The way intuition operates is what I use to define this metaphysics. My metaphysics for Eleutherianism serve as both refutation of Kant and its own morality. So what is the metaphysics for a philosophical intuition? The first task is to add all the thought phenomena that goes into formulating a morality. I will do this with the most flexibility first and then seek to constrain the process. Consequentialism is a judge morality, Eleutherianism as the guide, Hermenism as the final judge. This separate function of morality serves to illustrate the need for separate moral laws, as no one moral law can fulfill both the function of judge and guide. Hermenism serves as our judge of whether actions are judged to be good or evil in hindsight, not whether the actor was justified in the action. The best way to define the metaphysics of intuition is to observe the phenomenon of thought in our process of deciding what is moral. These phenomena are then formalized into one consequentialism that maximizes morality as essence in its judgment. The way to maximize morality is to assign rights, proximity to harm, and all moral phenomena, valid or not, a value to consider in the calculus. This valuation is just a trick to establish a metaphysics for how we evaluate morality intuitively. This does not have any moral foundation until we seed it from the definition of the good will. An example of the metaphysics of intuition is whether investing in a company was a good idea. If I made money, which was the aim, then it was a good idea. If I lost money, then it is judged by me as a bad result and thus a mistake. This is done intuitively and without the seeding of the goodwill. The use of Eleutherianism as a guide morality influences how we evaluate a consequentialism and creates Hermenism. Hermenism is essentially a judge of morality with the same underpinning moral values as Eleutherianism. Not only that, but Hermenism has influence into how to calculate moral duty and provides an intuition pump into calculating what Eleutherianism tactics to use to maximize good. Chopping up the action. EJ or Eleutherian justified is an interaction where the subject determines that there is a duty to do something, but the action results in a bad outcome. This interaction leads us to a special case of ELH as it is, if you use judge morality, an immoral act, but the actor is not culpable in the action. This is the failure of us to assess what the duty is in terms of the iterative process of the goodwill. We see that this is the failure of the goodwill to have knowledge of what is the process by which we achieve the best result. EJs only come about due to a failure of the subject's knowledge of how to achieve the moral result. This means that there is the constraint of humanity on the subject that allows them to fail to achieve a good result. It would be a failure of duty to not perform the activity that is an EJ. Thus, all EJs are justified by the guide morality and are just a failure of the human subject's knowledge of how to achieve the best result. Mapping out activity. Good as an abstract category needs some clarification for us to continue. All good is seeded from Kant's definition of the good will, but there is some difference in how we define good as it comes from the higher abstract ideal of the interactions between guide and judge morality. Call the definitional proof of good as all moral phenomena comes from a hitob, the definition of good being what comes, in this case, from Kant's definition of the good will. Hitob, the truth value of both guide and judge morality. This is shown in the interactions of before, during, and after an action. The judge morality determined in a hitob is what is the good result. The judge morality of ELH being Hermanism. The performative-based good, before the action assembled into duties to act on, is Eleutherionism. Both are needed, and a hitob does have both with the special cases of an EJ or HJ implied. Thus, all good in ELH comes from the definitional proof of a hitob being the interactions of the guide and judge morality. Constraining morality and the spectrum of ethical action. The act of constraining morality is harder with this critique of Kant. This is because judgment and subjective wills become involved in the process, rather than just Kantian scope action and the tests. We seek through the assignment of duties and the intuition pump of EL on the metaphysics of intuition a spectrum of allowed morality. It is a spectrum because we have freedom or preference as a value in H, and the act of choosing a formulation of H leads us to favoring one moral value over another for the reason of judgment. The argument is that since there are many correct formulations of seated duty or EL, then there are many H's that can result. The formulation of H is what differs into one spectrum, not to mention that the performative morality or best practices leads to an ELH based on empirics. The phenomena of formulating H is that it all comes from duty assignment in EL. This leads to a problem of how to maximize duty rather than just permissible actions. Thus, EL leads to the spectrum of H, and H leads to maximized duty of EL. This iterative process allows us to see the seeds of morality closely, and due to there being no intuition pump for moral phenomena of H, we find that we seed ELH from duty assignment for EL. This is still the same as seeding from H just within the metaphysics of EL. What is the difference in morality if we start from consequentialism? If the formulation is perfect, then we can see that we end up with the same or similar moral truth, but not from the same moral metaphysics. Wavum consciousness. The Wavum consciousness of ELH creates the proper will of EL. This will is an adaptive Wavum consciousness that I will do the best good. This is just defined as the process by which ELH makes moral decisions. Wavum consciousness is to stand opposed to the categorical way Kant asks us to make our duty selection. Wavum is the adaptation to circumstance by the will rather than the categorical consciousness of Kant with the duty selection of Kantian scope. The best way to describe a Wavum consciousness is with failures of the second order. The position of the first order is to use Wavum consciousness to get the best result given the circumstances. The duty of the hunter-gatherer in prehistory is different from the duty of the modern shopper. If the hunter-gatherer needs calories, it is permissible to hunt for them. If the shopper needs calories, it is not permissible to kill your dog and eat it for dinner, as you can just as easily go to the store. If the shopper is stranded on a desert island with their dog and needs the calories to survive, then it is permissible to eat the dog. This process by which the good will adapts to higher order constructions or circumstances is Wavum consciousness. Valid cases of history. Valid cases of history are described as culpa from cases of the past. Using atomizing, we can see when something offers harm or benefits from the knowledge of the cause. This means that something, through inspection, can be classified as good or bad due to the effect it has had on the agents that it impacts. All cases of history come from an understanding of the effect of construction of spaces and the construction of wills, culpa being theses down to the atom. Here are the atoms of good. It is called the invention of good as I seek to create and map out the forces that the good will imposes on the world. Here are the three forces of the good will, duty to the subject, duty to the abstract good, and duty to the will. The good will can be broken up and defined in many ways. This is the one I chose for it, as it is the first one I completed with my own thoughts. There are many ways to develop the implications of the good will, and, as we discuss in the seeds section, this is my way of breaking up the good will and the implications from it. First, what is implied in the definition of Kant? The duty to good and the duty to the good-willed is all that is implied from the definition of the good will. Thus, there are two implications from the good will: the duty to the good-willed subject and the duty to the good of the good will. The proof of abstract will is one that is done through the duty of the subject. We know what is good from the good will's duty to advancing the good will and the good-willed subject. Then we use this proof of what is good to speculate on what is the duty to good in the abstract. The third portion of the will-based good definition is that of the good of just the will itself. This is proven two ways, so let's begin discussing them. The duty to any subject is considered by the process of the good will willing good. To have good in the first place, we see that we must have something to do good on. This is how the duty to the subject is confined to any duty. I simply chop this into the atom of good, as all good comes from the good of a subject. This, just like abstract good, results in the goodwill doing what is best for the subject. Even nominal good. Any subject can have good, animal, plant, human, or thing. This good is defined from the seeds of Hermenism as something that allows for the respect of the subject itself. This takes a little investigation into what respects the subject, but use the wisdom of humanity to see that good is the respect of the subject. The process by which we discover good is the application of the good will, or what is good for the good-willed subject, and then the application to the subject that the good will aims to do good on. These are the aims of the goodwill that are confirmed scientifically by a little investigation into whether the activity was good for the subject. In essence, it asks, if the subject had the goodwill, what would good be? The good of the subject, then, is the moral respect of the subject through the confirmation by experience, wisdom, or anything that results in us knowing from experience what is good for that subject. If we know what good is for one subject as an aim, then we know the good or the aims of the good will for all other subjects. The good of a subject then comes from the good of the good-willed subject, as the aims of good are the same as for any subject with shared history. The aims of the good will towards the subject or construction are covered in seeds of ELH. The good of things has implications for property and ecology. Where does the good of a rock come from metaphysically? It comes from the duty to the subject as a rock. Is rock harm immoral? Only if it is possible to harm a rock, which it is not. A rock then becomes a thing of something greater than itself, such as a sculpture, token to take home, or a part of an environment. This means that to advance good for the rock, we must see that it has no good or evil to do onto it. It is the purpose of the thing that allows for there to be creative destruction and dutiful lawful maintenance on it. The goodwill allows us to see a rock as free or as property and influences our duty to the rock in that manner. We find that our duty to a rock is the duty to the thing as a way to see that we must have a duty to the rock's agent-based relationship. It is only possible to harm a rock as a violation of duty as we see that it comes from the agent-based relationship of the rock. Thus, the destruction of a mountain is a crime against nature only if the agent-based relationship of the natural world is protected. It is our duty not to burn down the rainforest to create crop fields, insofar as there is no moral claim on that plot of nature. It is impossible to construct a good of a rock from the process of atomizing, as only the agent-based relationship allows the rock moral protection. What is the good calculus when subjects come in conflict? The Jainist argument of all living things is extended in the duty to the subject atomization. It is even more strict as it calls for the rights of not just living things, but also things themselves. The debate about greater good versus do no harm is solved through the good calculus. The goodwill solves this with the good calculus of the aims of the definition of the goodwill. Necessary evil is allowed if it is done through the duty of the subject of the necessity of atomic harm to do good for the world. Look to the claim calculus and the slaughter of plants to feed vegans in the modern world. The slaughter of plants is necessary to maintain the good of the human world. Thus, we must look towards the necessary evil of the atomized duty to the subject to determine if it is moral to exist at all. This leads us to the global aims of the goodwill to maximize all good in the world. The lion exists in nature to slaughter and maintain the natural order. The goodwill cannot access the lion as much as the lion can't change its ways to serve nature better. Thus, we look towards the ethics of conservation to maximize the good of the natural world. Humanity has failed the duty of conservation in the modern world, but does that mean we must plot genocide to maintain human good? There are two global worlds, one in which we accept the human good as the supreme good, and one in which we accept the global ethics of conservation. These two worlds conflict, but I favor a consciousness of both. Humanity must fulfill the ethics of conservation to maintain the world and their place in it. Just as the lion keeps the antelope from overpopulating and eating themselves to starvation, the human must live with regard to the natural and social world. There are extreme examples where killing someone to survive in the world is allowed, but humanity is smart and adaptable. Almost always a maximization of duty can be found without calling for genocide or murder due to the casing of human existence as inherently evil. Remember, even if human existence is cased evil, the goodwill simply looks to remedy this through good activity until humanity can adapt to preserve a world for themselves and any subject within their world. What is the ranking of good between subjects? If plant good comes before all, you see that the ethics of conservation still calls for plant slaughter to maintain the best world for the plants themselves. If the good calculus calls for human good, then we must not forget that the natural world sustains us and allows us to maximize the good in the world from all subjects, not just humanity. Thus, the good calculus is the same with all good being held in the same regard. We seek a world where all good is maximized, not just human good. The good of the will plays second fiddle to the duty of the goodwill, with the goodwill recognizing the duty to the will as well. Thus, even if human good is willed supreme, the goodwill wills the same or similar duty remains the same. If the goodwill deems the good of the natural world more important than humans, we find that the good of the humans is still weighed and maximized. Humanity must adapt to the circumstances of the world to maintain the best processes for good to be realized. What does this mean in terms of the ranking system? Need a human being to die for plants to live? Do plants need to die for human beings to live? The acknowledgement that the duties from the good will is created from global aims. Unless we can play God and design immortality and the end of necessary evil, we find that there are no moral aims that don't adapt to circumstances. The good of the human is the good of the tomato, and the slaughter of the plant is the good of the plant in this ideal moral universe. The duty to abstract good comes from the process of the goodwill willing good. Everything has moral consideration under the goodwill as a process of the goodwill willing good. What does a goodwill do but will the good of all things? This is definitionally true, as the process of the goodwill willing is in itself moral consideration. The goodwill cannot look at anything, even a rock, and not give it moral consideration. Thus, all abstract good comes from the goodwill's process of willing. This means that if we know the good of a subject, we must perform it in order to will good. We know subject good for the good-willed subject, as Hermenism is simply that without the duty to abstract good. The abstract good of animals is thus the seated Hermenism of the duty to animals from our knowledge that animals are worthy of moral consideration. There is no reason to differ from subject good and abstract good, as they are the same performatively. The duty to the will comes from the duty to abstract good and the duty to the subject. It is the duty to will that allows for the good of freedom and culture in our societies. From the duty to abstract good, we find that the will itself is something to will good towards. The duty to the subject can also be found in the duty to the will, as the subject is also its will. Take systems of property as a theory of good that has certain restrictions on material. The theory of good is imposed on those that cause a certain history. Proper dress is largely a theory of the third order. To get a fourth order theory, or a spectrum of theories of good, I call the fourth order impositions on proper dress attire politic. This is the fourth order container for any theories of good that are about dress. Thus, instead of British fashion being the moral imposition for all people as a third order duty, we find that there is a spectrum of allowable dress politics that comes from the respect of the will of each person and individual. These are just my definitions, and the history of dress interacts with both fourth and third order duties. The need for this fourth order policy is often done through global agreement, such as the standard of suits in places of business. Does this mean that a fashionable person can act immorally by wearing or not wearing something that doesn't conform to norms? Yes, such as being naked at a global summit as a diplomat for Thailand WC. Now that good is invented, what are the seeds that allow for the construction of a judge morality? Willed ends are the seeds of ELH. These ends can be proven to be ends empirically. We can make abstract predictions of what the seeds imply and how they interact with each other. All seeds come from the goodwill, so we can see that they all have a definitional basis. The seeds, as they are defined, have an interesting phenomena, that is, they all intersect. Freedom intersects with welfare, justice, and quality of life in a way that allows all seeded values to represent the same essence of morality. This leads us to the problem of definition for specific values. The definitions all come from Kant's definition of the goodwill, and are thus the chopping up of processes to determine the goodwill's presence in reality. I call this the fusion of the goodwill. All values come from this one definition and are thus defined with the common signifier of what we would define as the value as in the dictionary. There can be many justices, welfares, and goods. These seeds hope to map out most of these processes of the goodwill, and I have done my best in this section to cover the most important ones and the process of creating one if I have failed to map out the immense amount of processes that can be defined. All seeds are proven the same way: the practice of the goodwill, the measurement of the practice, and the interaction between the two. For demonstration, the value survival, which I define as the furthering of the will, is proven from what the goodwill wills for the continuation of the will, how well the will is continued, and the interactions between the two. Survival for giraffes is measured in how well the giraffe reproduces, eats, and is safe from predators. The things giraffes do to accomplish these things are the tactics for survival. This is true for every seed. The empirical side is provided by a scientific method or iterative process of learning through experience that determines what the goodwill should do in practice. The a priori knowledge of the seed is the definition from the goodwill of the seed. Justice is the most complicated seed of morality. It is the seed which constitutes judgment, fairness, and all things that are just. We see justice with several cases. The first, the settling of disputes. All goodwill definitions can come from the goodwill itself and the outcome of the seeded Hermanism. The seeds of morality, such as justice, are performative definitions that are just what the goodwill does to perform this value with the iterative action of ELH to create best practices. Fair ground is the process by which the goodwill creates equity. It creates equity by the process of comparing based on seeded Hermanism for us to see the best ground to make a fair choice. An example: two children ask for a meal. One hasn't eaten today, the other has eaten too. Fair ground recognizes the difference and defines equity as that difference. The inequity then must be repaired in any fair choice. The child that hasn't eaten a meal is favored as an attempt to remedy this difference. Thus, in more complex choices, the actor repairs the difference, and that is the process of fair ground. Fair ends is the process by which the goodwill weighs fair results. What is fair in this case is the result. Take having one prosthetic leg to give to two boys. If the result of giving the leg to either boy is one person walking, then it is fair ends to give the leg to either of them. If the result denies the walking of one boy, then it is unfair ends to give it to that boy. Take, for example, one boy with one leg and one with no legs. Clearly, the fair thing is to not deny that one boy the ability to walk. Fairness is one of the processes by which the good will evaluates actions. Fairness is mapped out in fairground and fair ends as the consideration of the action before, during, and the action's effects. Before as the history component of fairground. During as the equality of wills and equity. This is during as fairground is the component of the goodwill that weighs the action equitably until equality takes hold. Thus, for the sake of mapping out the process by which the goodwill evaluates actions, we must evaluate it equally after considering history definitionally, the effects being the definition of fair ends. The process of evaluating fairness is essentially fairground or equity, equality of consideration, and then the result. The world may have different opinions on what is fairness, as the word is a general one, but El-Hian fairness is the combination of fairground and fair ends to produce a fairness which may differ according to different theories of good. There are cases of fairness where it is used colloquially to describe someone being unfair or even valid invented usage. These cases are not covered in El-Hian fairness directly. This is true of any ELH seed. The usage of El-Hian definitions are very specific and are not the dictionary definitions to be used informally. Just mastery. The just action that weighs moral content after the seeds is not what this section is about. Only the seeds of justice, however vague, are discussed in this section. Just result is the aim of the goodwill. It is the most just and thus good result of activity. This is the process by which a good will finds its aims for a construction of the will to be just, or the aim of justice in the good-willed subject or system. The mastery of justice that must come after a crime is the process by which we restore harm to a subject. This is called subject justice. This subject can be a state, person, group, or anything that can be wronged. The evil to this subject is measured, and the process by which we seek correct restitution for the subject is justice. The seed is from the will, so if the subject wants the assailant harmed, that is subject justice. If the subject wants to be paid by the assailant, that is subject justice. If the subject wants to forgive, that is subject justice. Any combination of these things is the direction of the subject. Thus, subject justice is defined as the restorative process of the good will making good for the wrong subject's will. This does not imply that we do exactly what the wrong subject demands, but that subject justice is always in the direction set by the wronged will. Punitive justice is the aim of the good will to punish someone through harm for a crime. This usually means that the aim of the will is simply to punish on principle in relation to subject justice. There are many reasons why culturally punitive justice is used in history, but the good will must have a good reason to punish, as punitive justice is the only form of justice that I personally think is misused widely. Most systems of authority have punitive justice built in to disallow certain behaviors that are merely an expression of freedom. Restorative justice is the process by which the harm of something is undone. This is the remedy of the good will. One takes the continuous harm of the method and attempts to prevent harm in the future through moral activity. All other methods of rule are constrained in the section on just mastery. Principal justice. The principal value of any moral value is the value's H value without the effect of the value. There is an implied, from the definition of the goodwill, philosophical value to any principal value, and ELH functions without them. I call the theory of good the theory of what the H values should be in actual practice of morality, principled if it takes into account the Kantian way of adding principal values to the calculus, and pragmatic if it ignores the principle and only assesses the effect. This leads us to principled justice, or principled H-value imposition in general. First, the general philosophy of principle H-value. The imposition of principles come from our knowledge of a kingdom of ends. Basically, there is a reasonable good culture that decides whether the principles that are seen as virtuous must be upheld. There is the kingdom of ends activity to define what these principles are. To punish a child for lying if the lie doesn't have an immoral effect is to construct the habit of the kingdom of ends. It is prudent as the lie is disciplined out of them. In adult spaces, it is often rude or unnecessary to punish a lie if the effect is positive or if there is no effect of a greater harm, even without a remedy. This means a lie to kill someone is differently mastered than a lie to compliment an ugly sweater. Here are some more definitions. Positional injustice is defined as all choices being unjust. This is a failure of higher order duties. Reward comes from the will as a result of the activity needing the reward. The direction of the reward being the will's decision. Thus, money is only a reward as long as the will seeks it. The direction of the reward being what the subject needs and wants to do their duty in the world. Usually, systems of reward are construed as systems of exchange. The second-order construction of the reward system being the exchange of money for labor, food for money, or money for money. Systems of reward are different from systems of exchange, as they represent all forms of activity rather than systems of exchange. For example, the reward for taking medicine is the presence of better health or the alleviation of symptoms. All rewards are based on experience and justification for what happens to the human subject after the activity that causes the reward to occur. Reward cannot be the allowance of immoral activity. This is not a reward but a detriment. There is no goodwill that rewards someone with something that allows others to be wronged. Consent is defined as the willing of the activity within personal subject's personal control. The two types of consent being what the personal will wills and what the agent-based duty wills. Consent itself operates as a fully realized kingdom of ends. If all respect all wills, we get a similar kingdom of ends as free societies. This means consent can be violated if it results in duty to be done. Authority is defined as the willing of the activity based on professional duty. Professional duty being someone who has the duty of study, experience, or anything that results in a better decision-making process that can be empirically measured. Authority can also come from stations, as generals can order soldiers to do things or doctors prescribing medicine. Theft can be defined two ways, as the improper or lack of correct activity in a system of exchange that is based on ELH. This system must be defined as a consciousness of property that is accepted and considers all aspects of the moral social order, and the first-order duty of theft, or the Hermanist-based judgment, that must be negative in order for us to consider it crime. The consciousness of property can be based on the synthesis of these two things, as both are forces that must be united to have a coherent theft policy. The principle of theft is often when the goodwill fails in the duty to construct spaces where all prosper. Thus, the duty of crime prevention is a duty of the second order and is to construct spaces where there is no need for crime. Claim is what is used to settle disputes around property. Ownership is defined as property being socially accepted as yours. Think of the world as a lawless place where claim is defined by the maximization of good. If a priceless artifact is owned by a museum for display, you can't steal it to create a museum or collection of your own due to the process of just ownership. Even if duty compels you to steal, you must steal with regard to the process of the goodwill, deciding ownership through moral claim. In a true kingdom of ends, the owner would just give it to you if it maximizes good. The duty to ownership is a real socially and morally constructed consciousness that prevents the injustice of forcing people to give up what is sentimentally and materially theirs. Take a billionaire and the amount of unnecessary money they have. The fact that people are poor is not a reason to steal from the billionaire, it is a reason for the billionaire to donate to charity. If the social order does not reach a level of functional society defined in my section on social orders, then the billionaire must be forced to do their duty. Their duty often the creation of a social order that benefits them just as much as the people who have want. Seeds of history. History is defined as the past AJI of the reality that is under consideration for the decision of the adjudicatory process of the goodwill. History is simply anything that is used to determine the duty to the mores or soul of ELH in the case of coming up with a promise of the social order. It is the past as defined by the social contract in democracy or the aim of legitimate rule in other systems of government. The process by which the goodwill decides what is legitimate history that should be used in the adjudicatory process of the goodwill is the seeds of history. Most of these seeds are essentially the mores of social order along with the effect of changing the social order. If something fails or is seen as needing to change, it is the seeds of history that identify the wrong and attempt to progress society. These seeds are anything that is used to make a moral decision when there is no clear direction to progress in. Usually these take effect when someone is trying to adjudicate activity that is not clearly immoral, and thus reflect cases when the good will find strong arguments on both sides. This is usually then settled with diplomacy and a compromise, if there can be one. Other definitions from the goodwill. All definitions of ELH come from the goodwill. If I have missed a seed, which I should as there are innumerable, then I should describe the process of the seeding from the goodwill. The seed begins in one of two places: the process by which the goodwill does something, or the way how experience is measured with regard to the effect of the process of the goodwill or any will doing something. These are the two starting points of any seed of ELH. So the seed of just tax law is the effect of the goodwill on the activity of taxes. The act of determining consent is the process of the goodwill ascribing the ability of an agent to will the activity within their sphere of consent or personal regard. This is highly circumstantial and is a seed from freedom. It is the innumerable activities and circumstances of the seeds of Hermenism that make it impossible to define them all. So accept a process as a simple substitute to allow your own definitions. Taking into account the AJI of an action as a variable, there are failures even to these definitions. The need for a definition to account for circumstances is what demands for a systematic process to occur, a whole language of the goodwill.
Morality and agentivity. Agentivity is the process by which moral truth is constructed. The debate around objective and subjective moral truths is one that seeks to frame the debate as a process of knowledge. I know a rock is an object and a person is a subject, but moral truth comes from the respect of both object and subject. The rock can behave morally and immorally, not as a question of activity, but a question of agents. The subject can decide morality for themselves and their agents from a position of ignorance of the objective truths that may blind them from their own duty to themselves and others. Agentivity is just the name I give the structure of moral truth. It comes from a place of both objectivity and subjectivity into something from both. The need for agentivity is not a necessary one until one enters the lens of this objective versus subjective debate. Agentivity offers clarity on how something of moral consideration becomes moral. ELH is both subjective, objective, and agentivistic morality, as it constructs from all three lenses. Best practices. The duty to best practices is a duty of merit. It calls us all to be the best version of ourselves for the sake of good. This is not an imposition on the morality of failure, but a duty to perform ourselves morally according to a theory of good that agentivistically benefits both ourselves and others, a theory of good from the agents and our part to play in the world. If there is a need in the world for work, then one must work. If there is a need for ourselves to rest, then one must rest. The morality of failure is a morality of remedy for the failure. This means mistakes, not crimes, are punished to repair harm and repair the space or AGI of the mistake. Circumstances must allow us to perform our role and talents. This recognition of talent is the allowance of AGI that benefits the subject. This duty speaks to putting meritable people in positions to succeed. It is mostly about the construction of the spaces that put able people in positions to have a moral influence on the world. Doctors must be allowed to save lives. People with merit must be allowed to be the good in the world with support and hierarchy to advance good. This duty is the recognition that cooperation, space creation, and rule must be in the interest of knowable aims to do good and best practices. In the age of AI, this may not always be a human. The Hermanist calculus. The decision about what is a good result is what this section is about. This is my own theory of good. The act of atomizing good comes from comparable values, a leg for a leg and an eye for an eye. So what is the calculus to do for values that are incomparable? The example of an unjust activity for greater good, a choice between surviving and suffering. The good of a human actor can replace the agents that exist in the world. Thus, as philosophers before me, I contemplate suicide. Take all the good an agent does and come to a decision about whether they should take their own life. Agent-based good, such as the duty to survive for your children, spouse, and whatever good you engage in socially, is weighed with the respect of the will to end the suffering of the subject. We can look to examples of good where it is quite easy to have the allowance of the suicide, as we don't need the person socially, but rather we need the person emotionally. If you have family or a support structure that needs you, suicide is almost never a completion of your duty. How does this weigh in the Hermanist calculus? The right or principle of suicide to end your own suffering is compared to the suffering of the world, family, or any agents that rely on you. Take, for example, a man who suffers from schizophrenia and depression that goes poorly treated. Consider this man highly functioning but with a disease that would cripple anyone but this man, a strong man who does his duty. All moral factors from the seeds are weighed into the good of the man extending his will. All harm from the fact that the man is suffering is placed on the opposite side of the scale. This is done in any judge calculus to determine if the suicide is justified. We assume that the man has committed suicide, for all judge activity is in hindsight, and then assess whether this is a moral action. The end of his suffering is the good of the activity. The end of his agent-based good, the harm. We see that in reality, there is activity that could be done to justify the moral taking of a life. This includes creating the second-order space where the man is not needed in the world, and they can leave it with very little harm outside of the inherent good and love they bring to the world that only they can do. This activity includes, but is not limited to, financial support for the people that rely on him, completing the duty of raising a child to something that can handle the world, and the acceptance that the man must die for him to end his suffering in the eyes of his beloved. This, in all cases in reality, is called a made moral. The man takes the harms of his death and remedies them before the activity occurs. If the man cannot do this, then the activity is still immoral by agent-based responsibility. If the man can do this, then the activity is almost always moral. Thus, in this example, the Hermanist calculus provides us with the upsides and downsides of the activity in question and seeks the consciousness of the good will from our knowledge of it. The act of suicide is, with all things in ELH, a circumstantial moral calculus. The good of the man's existence versus the need to end their suffering can be remedied by activity until the man is allowed his death. As we get to the higher order values, such as justice, welfare, survival, and good in the abstract, we find that due to the definitions from the goodwill, all are easily comparable. The problem then is the comparison of whether we find a cooperative or minorly favored value to put in the calculus. Claim is defined as the process by which the goodwill decides what to own, use, or manufacture to do the most good. Moral claim is the ability to produce a good result with the ability to create a better world. Take the claim of the second order at the dinner table. One person hogging the food and only giving someone scraps to make their meal is morally reprehensible. This is proven through the course of food being used for the greatest good or good itself. The second-order duty at the dinner table is to feed everyone their fill and provide the most nutrition to the most amount of people. Therefore, claim is the decision of the second order to provide a culture of doing things that maximizes all moral good. The tradition of this duty is often done through the creation of culture that maximizes the selection and nutrition of its performers. Many people would argue that first come, first serve is a good example of the spectrum of the second-order duty to allow for all to have an enjoyable meal. Claim over property is essentially the same thing, a consciousness of use that allows for all to prosper with its deciding mechanism. If you have a home and someone is homeless, it is good for you to offer them a bed. If society has a home and someone is homeless, it is the moral duty of the second and third order to provide the maximum amount of shelter to the maximum number of people. Claim for scarce resources is also solved this way. Take lakeside property under capitalism. The claim of the property is decided by those who can afford it. If society had a system of reward of true good, where virtue decided payment and result, we would see that these homes would be in a Wavum claim consciousness, where we allow the owner to maximize the good value to the people of their agents, if under tradition, or people who want to use it from their will. Ethical systems of exchange are created from this property and claim consciousness. The willingness of the good-willed worker to do their duty to the system of exchange is caused by the system in its construction. Lele is the term of allowance over something through claim and duty. This is the allowance of use without ownership, the claim by which the worker's labor is done for the good of the society or second-order construction of the system of exchange, or system of lele, depending on the malleable imposition of the goodwill. Thus, the worker's time, blood, sweat, and tears is constrained to the places where they can do the most good for the society and the measurable constructions of the will, decided by the representative of the second or third order. In freedom, this is done through the act of moral incentive. This representative is called the designer or ruler of the second or third order, respectively. In freedom, this is the construction of the exchange that satisfies both parties. Take into account that the construction of the space for the people that do the real work must also take their wills into account. It is a mutually beneficial relationship that has duty both ways. The tyranny of property is one formulation that allows for the fairness of those who pay for things to get their will respected, but the many formulations of taking into account best practices and the system seeing those that labor as wills over their own work. This means that in the construction of the second order, there is a duty to go against the tyranny of property if it is unsafe or impossible to do according to the person's ability or constraints. There are innumerable constructions of systems of exchange, from Russian feudalism to British aristocracy to American socialism to Italian capitalism. All these systems of exchanges under Eleutherian Hermanism must strive to do good as seen by changes in structure and adaptation to circumstances. Whatever the system is, its failings and its blessings, there must be a consciousness or structure of change to promote moral good. This comes from the duty to the will. Take the right to petition your government for redress in the United States of America. This allows for people to change the system that governs them, albeit with imperfection. Reward can be for any order duty. From the first to the fourth, reward is abstractly defined under ELH as something which both satisfies the goodwill for moral activity and benefits the subject of the reward. The system by which reward is offered is the essential question of desire versus effect. What is the process by which the duty of your agents or the world rewards you for good? Often the reward is seen as one-to-one, meaning if I give you something, I lose something. Given that that is often the failure of higher-order systems of reward and exchange, the will is driven towards cooperation as a way of human reward. This means that any promise or activity can be used as a means of reward in the construction of the will within some constraints of decency. The aim of the goodwill is always to satisfy the goodwill and act as though the human will is good before it fulfills the human desire. But there are times when humans will things that are unrealistic or not a proper duty. This means that reward must further the aims of the goodwill in order to be moral reward. Take the process by which loyalty is given and taken in politics. Loyalty is the promise of activity that advances the subject on which someone is loyal to. This can lead us into the abuses of charismatic leaders with angry subjects onto the recipients of those who are perceived in the wrong. This means that any reward must be constrained by the effect and the awareness of the subject who is rewarding as to what the actor will do with the reward. This caveat often comes in questions of who should have power. This problem is solved by the process by which the goodwill makes laws and enforces those laws. If we know something is immoral, then we should identify the activity that is immoral and then outlaw it. If we know someone is not acting in good faith, then we see that the goodwill must put constraints on the power of the individual through mythos or checks and balances that prevent harms from being carried out. This means that the reward of power comes with the recognition of duty, and thus should only be rewarded in cases of when it is our duty to reward with power as it advances the cause of good. All other rewards don't fall victim to this problem except in cases of monopoly, and these cases are adjudicated in the same way. Thus, reward is not a resistance to good or justice, but the presence of it. This is harder to set up in practice, but the aim of the goodwill is very clear. The process by which wills are respected can also be done through higher order rewards. This is essentially the changing of guard in a democratic society, as the wills of the people demand a different social arrangement and contract. This process can be as simple as whether to reward someone socially and is the basis of individual reward in community. If I am a global soccer player at the highest level, I am allowed in a certain system and community that gives me privileges and rewards simply on merit. These rewards include love from the community of fans and certain class privileges such as getting into popular nightclubs or other venues. It is this process by which all things are socially rewarded. In a democratic politics, the trust of the people is enough to impose my will in laws and regulations in order to pass policy and practice statecraft. These are rewards of the higher orders, as it allows me a certain power over the reality of the agents by which society is constructed. Back on the question of setting up systems of reward, where the benefit is not one-to-one. These often, second-order constructions are the best way to ensure a fair system of exchange that allows all to prosper. Take the second-order constructions of the imposition of legal tender. It is the agreement that no matter who you are, the person can receive fair treatment and respect if they have the means to acquire it. The failure of this imposition is that it often prevents people from doing their duty simply for no gain. This imposition is often improved by charities and social work, but the problems of the economy often prevent people from doing their duty when placed in such situations where they are not given fair ground compared to an acceptable baseline or security net. Homeless children and teenagers are an example of this. Another example of the failure of the imposition of legal tender is the working poor. This is the failure of the society to do its duty to those who work and provide labor, as they are not able to earn anything but a meager living for themselves and their agents. These failures are solved by rewards of higher order. This is essentially the process by which society manages the baseline of the lowest in the economic order. The soul of ELH is the process by which the goodwill stands for values outside of the imposition of ELH to construct a reality that is based on norms of history. This mainly applies to the construction of moral norms that have the virtues of decency or the interaction with theories of good outside the construction of ELH. Take, for example, the construction of peer pressure in the consciousness of any subject. The goodwill finds that even if the first and second order construction of the social space is morally justified from the good of the creation of the social space, due to some argument from tradition, history, or social pressure, the individual can still exercise a moral duty not to do that activity. Take, for example, the changing of the European greeting of kissing each other on the cheek to an obscene or objectifying genital touch. Even if the socializing of this made-up society deem it rude not to touch each other on the genitalia, and there is a real breach of etiquette to not perform this activity. There is the conception of the soul of ELH to allow for the actor not to behave according to the more. This comes with essentially the duty of the goodwill to history and tradition of all the prior moral frameworks such as religion, etiquette theory, and respect for the conception of private parts. The construction of the will for the child in respect to social norms can have theories of good of the second order that maintain the history of the social respect designed from theories of good that are not Elahist in nature. This also applies to the maintenance of the principle problem and the argument between greatest good for the greatest number and our own conception of morality as a reasonable will. The problem of forced organ donation is an example of an imposition of the soul of ELH to a moral problem that could be justified under the blind pursuit of the best moral reality. Imagine yourself to be a surgeon, a truly great surgeon. Among other things you do, you transplant organs, and you are such a great surgeon that the organs you transplant always take. At the moment, you have 5 patients who need organs. 2 need 1 lung each, 2 need a kidney each, and the 5th needs a heart. If they do not get those organs today, they will all die. If you find organs for them today, you can transplant the organs and they will all live. But where to find the lungs, the kidneys, and the heart? The time is almost up when a report is brought to you that a young man who has just come into your clinic for his yearly checkup has exactly the right blood type and is in excellent health. Lo, you have a possible donor. All you need do is cut him up and distribute his parts among the 5 who need them. You ask, but he says, "Sorry, I deeply sympathize, but no." Would it be morally permissible for you to operate anyway? This is the principle problem, or the resistance to the best result out of the construction of moral virtue. Don't let perfect get in the way of good in this case. Even if the circumstances determine that forcing someone into organ donation saves 5 lives and sacrifices 1, force can still be used to justify the lack of a good result, just based on the argument from the soul of ELH. There are many cases where past theories of good don't force the moral actor into participating in the best practice in terms of the result. This is precisely why the soul of ELH is needed. It was found in that circumstance, the soul of ELH is the phenomena in which we look outside the metaphysics of ELH to find what is the best way to do good. This, in practice, is just an atom in the Hermanist calculus. This is the only process of the goodwill that is anti-good as a result. This is called the soul, as it is the only process of the goodwill that comes from the respect of humans and their will as rational moral agents, and not the scientific definition of the goodwill. It assumes, and this is an assumption, that good comes from the consensus of moral-minded individuals and not just the moral calculus, for the metaphysical proof of the goodwill. Doing this, it comes from the respect of the will of the human moral subject, and is the attempt at maintaining a Kantian-influenced theory of good. The soul of ELH is what justifies the history of good coming together to maintain a good reality that is respecting the will of personal opinion and history. It is the respect of the will of the moral knowledge of ourselves and scholars. This is justified in the maintaining of real impositions on the moral actor that come from the goodwill's duty to the moral opinion of scholars. It is essentially a way to protect the actor from a blind duty to society, and at the same time, be the duty to moral society. I call this atomized process of the goodwill the duty to the mores. What is the good resistance that justifies the worst result? This is left up to the mores as established through authority. The good resistance is any reasonable amount of harm that occurs from our resistance to a good result. This means that the calculus of the good result is impacted by a soul of ELH factor that results in something that is the duty to the philosophical mores and history of any moral agent. This is composed of the principles of the society. Not all moral principles are allowed under the soul of ELH, just those that shape history. Thus, forced organ donation is both permissible under the soul that calls for greatest good for the greatest number, and impermissible under the promise of justice for the individual. This creates something that is up to the wills of authorities of morality to call for a reasonable construction of the soul of ELH. This duty is entirely up to the process by which the goodwill decides what is good, not from the result, but from the promise of history, principles, and general good consensus. This is a chosen example of when forced organ donation is at its most convincing. Maybe no society that operates morally would allow this. A problem of the soul of ELH is the decision by which a good result is resisted. This atom, and this is the numerical imposition, is solved by theories of known good. It is easy to see that a non-biased actor can impose a certain number on when good is resisted, and a biased actor is entirely corrupted by this process, but the corruption is just as valid as the soul of ELH. It is a true moral phenomena to allow for the corruption to take place in order to truly understand when we resist a good result. That must be weighed in the soul of ELH. This makes it a mathematical calculus that takes our humanity into account.
The problems of adjudication of the problems of the world is what this section is about. Most people would agree that the problems of the world are caused through the failure of the construction of the world to incentivize and promote solutions. There are individual failures that can't be solved through anything but the restriction of freedom. There are systemic failures that often cause a restriction of freedom that incentivizes immoral behavior. There are problems of the political will of the world to side with immorality for human gain. There are problems of Republican constructions of power that prevent the use of rule to change the law to something that constructs a better reality. All of these problems are the problems of knowing what is right and wrong. If we could all agree on one system of adjudication and aims, then we could work towards those aims that allow for people to prosper. I think there is more malice in the world than one knows, but humans are often good at seeing when we should change for the better, especially when one is young and new to the world. This leads us to theories of change and ethical conflict. One must see that those who want to change the world need two things: a direction to change the world and the ability to influence power to change the world. This section is about the latter, as the former, if you side with morality, is answered, at least abstractly, by this book. The theory of how to adjudicate problems in the world is often solved positively. This means that if there is a problem in the world, one must construct the solution for themselves through the positive activity of being the solution in the world. The problems of most people are the lack of a system by which duty is done for themselves. The world needs people to invest in the time to construct realities where the problems that they themselves have had are solved. Then the world needs to replicate these realities until the moral construction of the will is realized. This is thus two things: freedom to use the tools available to you to realize your duty to yourself and others, and the use of power to impose the solutions onto the world. The use of power is quite difficult to achieve, at least in any society that is not a functioning democracy, and even there the problems of democracy take hold. The use of power comes from the constructions of power, and these come from the positive construction of yourself as an agent of change. This means that the first step to any ethical reality is the construction of yourself as an agent of morality. The world often prevents this construction of yourself, but there is much you can do to positively contribute to morality as an agent. Take systems of economies in your community. This second-order construction is often the most ruled part of our lives. Economic freedom, at least in America, allows us to change this construction of reality with a little amount of money and work. This is why America's second-order construction is almost constantly being changed. It is built and destroyed by the power of the dollar and the power of the state. This means that one who seeks a more moral arrangement must have both to truly influence the world. If you would like to change the power of the dollar, then you must change the power of the state. If you would like to change the power of the state, you must have the resources to allow for your movement to take hold. The easiest way for you to change the construction of your reality is by becoming it, owning and imposing your moral will on the world. If you lack the resources or the power to do this, such as someone in an authoritarian state or someone who is poor, then your duty is simply survival and the replication of yourself as doing the moral activity. You, by design, are constrained to the first-order process of doing your duty. If you would like to achieve higher-order solutions, then you must positively construct yourself as the solution to those things. This means studying law and politics for the third and fourth-order constructions, and studying business for the second-order constructions. The arrangement is often the process by which things change for the better, be it mutual aid of those you see as moral, or your agents, or impositions that cause the world to change for the better. The positive construction of yourself as an agent of change is the best way to prosper and be rewarded for morality. The world must give to you in order for you to give back. There are many ways to adjudicate conflict, and most of them are flawed. The best way to adjudicate problems in the world is through justice as a powerful force. If you are found in the wrong, justice should never side with you. At the same time, justice must know what the best result is, even in regard with you. The theories of adjudication are thus: how do we conflict with each other and prevent abuses of power, such as agent-based terrorism and using your position in the world to exert injustice on others? This is fundamentally a theory of power. There are many tactics by which immoral actors positively construct themselves to do wrong in the world. There are even more tactics by which moral actors can prevent this from happening as long as they have the material to do so. Investment in systems of justice is then the first duty of a social arrangement that seeks to prevent harm. This can be anything from the rule of law to an appointed figure that civil society looks to for their point of view. These tactics must come from a study of the world as proximity to the people who seek the justice and the satisfaction of the wronged will. I have outlined the process by which the good will repairs harm as subject justice, but there is much leeway in the process by which people are satisfied. This is only nominal justice, and the actual world requires much knowledge and proximity to the community, society, and mores that allow for the best theory of justice to take hold. Once a good-willed theory of justice as adjudication takes hold, it is impossible to stop the collective body from becoming moral. Once a system of justice takes hold, All people who are moral have a powerful system to rely on to allow for the advancement of the moral aims. It is this system of justice that allows the backbone of moral society. Systems of reward, law, power, and respect of the subject all come from the ability to do justice for those that wrong these systems. The first duty of any moral person is thus to know what justice is and positively construct themselves as an agent of justice. The construction of an adjudicatory hierarchy for disputes is the purpose of any construction of these systems. The need for enforcement of the goodwill is the aim of these systems. The adjudication of a street fight is done through power. The adjudication of a game is done through the rules of the game. The adjudication of good-willed adjudicatory systems is done through a process of justice, adjudication, and then the enforcement of the decision. An agent of justice within a system, such as a dean of a college, is informed of an offense and seeks to punish it according to the laws of the system. All good-willed adjudicatory systems follow this structure. These systems seek to provide justice for the subject if morally constructed. Injustice as a symptom of the system is the failure of the duty to the subject. A failure for groups to stand for justice is a failure of the group itself. It is usually a failure of the ruler if the laws themselves are unjust. A designer being unjust is the failure of the imposition of the constructions of society on the subject, such as the cases of environmental racism or meat served at restaurants. An agent of justice is an authority but must be constrained to morality. This is done through the siding of the process of justice, going through the adjudicatory process of the goodwill and siding with the decision of that process. It is your duty to side with justice. The decision of the good-willed adjudication must be followed if legitimate. The need for systems of justice to have real power is a double-edged sword. These systems must be guided by morality to do their duty to the subject, but these systems may be those that plague society if they go bad. Good-willed adjudicatory systems must have conditions that allow moral subjects to advance justice inherent in the system. This means a Republican resistance to democracy in the cases of minority rights, and a democratic process of respecting the will of the majority that legitimizes rule. The process of justice is done through fact-finding and moral perspective. It seeks to gain the facts of the case and treat people fairly. If someone has committed a crime, it is the agent of justice's duty to find the guilty party. Prejudice and bias must be stripped from the agent of justice's perspective, and advocacy of the accused are inherent in all moral systems of adjudication. Good-willed adjudicatory systems are preferable to taking justice into your own hands, as they provide good-willed authority to meet with good-willed power. For example, in the case of a robbery, if there is no good-willed adjudicatory system, then the victim must gain support for their case and then take matters into their own hands. This is usually always a failure of higher-order duties. A good-willed adjudicatory system allows for adjudication done by professionals rather than lay agents of justice. History, justice, or change, and choice. The process by which the goodwill constructs spaces to legitimize its rule is what this section is about. There are 3 stages in my theory of statecraft about the goodwill. The first, history, is the reality of the construction of the world. History represents the world's construction and all subsequent consequences of its construction. Justice or change, the second, represents the process by which the goodwill takes into account slights, damages, wills, and history's wrongs to change morally. Choice represents the state of the world after all harms and history have been changed to create the next process of history. These often occur simultaneously, and there is no phase in this historical process that is truly without history. This describes from the smallest of groups to the largest of bodies how the system performs morally. We must allow for people to write their own history, and we must take the examples of the past to prevent similar abuses towards those who should be protected. The example of HJG is the example of allowing people to come into something that resembles an adulthood rather than an imposed solution that often prevents the agency of those who are subjects. We are constrained by the impositions of powers that are greater than us, but we must, morally, allow people to constrain themselves for the good of others and the world. If we see that the problems of the past still occur, then we must make the effort to solve them through justice and change. It is this system of penance for our forefathers, or justice for our ancestors, that allow for society to enter into a truly realized kingdom of ends. People have been wronging people since the beginning of humanity, and it is our duty to advance the cause of morality into something that can be justified in every way. We pay penance for our ancestors' wrongs. We pay penance for our society's wrongs. We pay penance for our own wrongs. This is the only way to construct a system that allows for true kingdom of ends realization. The world must undo much of what it has done in order to allow for a construction of the will that is truly just and moral. We see that the opposite is true. Do not hold on to hate in your heart for the position others have placed you in. Hold on to the hope of a world where no one is forced into the same problems that have plagued society, that we receive what is passed down to us from our ancestors and must use our positions to change it into morality. Whatever that position is, it is the process by which we do penance or achieve justice for all that allows true, indisputable kingdoms of ends to come about. This means that the agent must go out into the world and seek to do right until there is no wrong. The problems of history are the problems of immorality realized on a scale that dwarfs any individual. But we can construct systems of justice and morality that settle these disputes for all and allow a realization of a kingdom of ends that truly allows us to be moral. Direct definitions and the blindness of containers. The process by which academic terms are defined are needlessly vague. This is done due to the constraints of language. This hides evil or lack of duty within the understanding of these terms. Take, for example, the term capitalism. This is a second, third, and fourth order construction that tells us nothing of the actual structure of the construction. The capitalism of China is different from the capitalism of America and Britain, for example. Even scholars find it hard to keep it straight. All second and third order constructions must use direct definitions to keep it straight. The term communism has so many different historical and theoretical definitions that it is useless as a term. Capitalism is the same way. The history is important, but for the best practices of consciousness, it is better to use direct definitions of these constructions. Then, American capitalism becomes economic freedom for the Republican, state-not-party construction of the economy. American communism becomes freedom for the people from state and business oppression. From these definitions, it seems as though the qualifier American creates a system that is more similar than different. Direct definitions allow for us to agree more than disagree over duty and the good of a moral construction, while allowing us to atomize the harms until they go away. All direct definitions of third and fourth order ideologies are the aims of the ideology or meta-ideology. Take gender politics, for example. The aim of the ideology is hidden in the container. The aim of liberal white feminism is equal civic rights. The aim of conservative gender policy is the imposition of the gender binary. We see that these containers must be different in the language of the goodwill to allow us a true understanding of what we mean by them. The outlawing of certain activity and the allowing of certain activity is inherent in all these containers. The language of the goodwill must then be the construction of a consciousness that knows what is outlawed and what is allowed. These ideologies and constructions must also bend to the subject if they seek justice for them. These are not hard and fast rules, but rather a social construction of the will that bends to install the best result for the subject. These containers must have direct definitions with the knowledge that the world is trying to do its duty to the subject. We all are ruled in one way or another, and we see that the rule must adapt to the world, person, and constraints to have duty be done to us. There is a process by which ideology psychologically forces us to defend it through seeing it as the good done to us and not the agents who actually do the good to us. This means that ideology often prevents us from seeing the world as a construction of wills that need to be adjudicated according to the activity of those wills. This is a tool by which people are blinded to their agent-based duty and see the world as ideas instead of activity. Ideas describe and help us see activity, but they are not activity. This consciousness of activity and those who do duty or harm is necessary for the subject to see what is actually good in the world. I ask you to look at your life and determine who has done the most duty to you, who has influenced you for the better, provided resources so you could prosper, and changed the way you saw the world. If you see this clearly, then you know who is good for you. This consciousness is the first step to seeing morally without containers that prevent us from seeing agent-based benefits and harms. All good will consciousness must see that the world is constructed and the good of the world comes from agents and activity. How should we positively aim to construct the world then? Systems of treatment. All systems of treatment come from the acknowledgement of spaces, survival being the first value of the second order. All space construction comes from resources and duty to the subject. There are three components of survival that determine if the duty to the subject is being performed from the space: access to water, access to food, and safety. These are subject aims. These are the three necessary components of any designed amicalogy for the home or living place. These three things are the duty to the subject in higher order constructions. All other things are the duty to the will. Third order duties to the subject are the presence of these things in ideology. They are the acknowledgement of systems as real guide-based systems. Guide is used here as the presence of order and time in the present. It is the term used to describe all things that are from choice or activity and impact higher order duties as a function of the present. It is the present activity of the good-willed subject. The detective's investigation is an example of how guide-based thinking is used to uncover reality and atomize for justice. Power is the ability to influence the constructions of the goodwill. Higher order power is the ability to make and, under guided present, enforce the systems of the goodwill. These needs are the most important duties, as all constructions of the will to further the good of the subject are the prerequisite to all other good. The simplest way to understand all impositions on the subject is the allowance of the subject. Does it result in everyone eating? Does it result in a livable, safe environment? How can the system serve rather than us serve the system? These questions are of paramount to the duty to the subject. Aims of the will. All other forms of expression of moral good from the will are the aims of the will. These are the spectrum of self-expression and mores that come from collections of agents. This is an agentivistic process where the good is agreed upon, changed, and made into a real moral imposition through the use of the adjudication of the agents. All aims of the will are inherent in the honest description of the imposition. This can be bottom-up in systems of moral democracy, but they can also be republican in case of moral failure. An honest deal with the goodwill is the easiest way to provide a certain task in the patchwork of society, to have and know the role that one must play. Duty to the will is inherent in moral philosophy, but it is the duty that prevents us from advancing in cases of immoral wills. The goodwill must be honest about its aims, even if they result in a worse world for morality. All third-order impositions must be described as what they are. Freedom, described as free will with the ability to position yourself better in society. Tradition is described as wisdom from the past that functions as a way to better yourself, and as the agentivistic mores that take shape. Change described as a solution to a problem of whatever imposition is currently in power. Aims of the will are the process by which morality advances or regresses to provide for the goodwill's power to be installed. The addition of the reality of the guide morality in practice is the process by which the good will weighs risk to determine the moral duty of an actor in the presence of real circumstances. The fact is that not all activities are going to succeed perfectly, and the goodwill allows us to see that we must make the most moral decision from the doubt of reality. Take a school shooter in the classroom. There is a possibility of disarming the shooter by tackling them. There is a possibility of escaping through the back door and surviving. There is also any activity such as playing dead, waiting for an opportunity to strike, or any possible activity to protect yourself and others. The most moral choice in hindsight is whatever succeeds in creating the best possible world for yourself and for others. If you can disarm the shooter and prevent deaths that way, we see that that is allowed. If it is a fool's errand and you will die, that is also a calculative risk that needs processing by the goodwill. The matter of risk is in the professional duty of the risk-taker to do what is needed at the time. The police officer may have a different duty due to experience or role-based agency than the student in algebra class. It is the scientific process of assessing risk that allows us to determine a theory of good in the moment, or through wisdom and training that allows us the best result. The process by which we determine the respect of the good will versus the respect of the human will is the process by which we determine what is good first, and then adjudicate the means or the way we acquire the aim. The process by which we decide to harm ourselves is essentially the process by which we value liberty versus the duty to ourselves. Crimes against yourself are indeed immoral, but how does this come about metaphysically? It comes from the ability to see if the human will is good or rather simply human. In perfect duty, we would not allow people to do things that harm for no other reason than their will, be it an unhealthy diet, smoking cigarettes, or speech that is harmful to other subjects. All these things come from the human will and not the good will. Does that mean we must institute vulgar perfection and punish anyone who doesn't do their duty? Don't let perfect get in the way of good. The Adam of Good clearly values freedom and says that these things are tolerable. Thus, the human will and the good will are not in conflict until we see that there are many ways to satisfy the imposition of the best result. This makes the Adam of Good truly a liberation instead of a slavery to the best result. The good will isn't satisfied by smoking cigarettes, but it is satisfied with the freedom of the individual to engage in unhealthy practices for pleasure. This is also true of anything that offers joy with some risk to the subject. We see perfect duty is not the abolition of the things that make life joyful, but the acceptance that the good will is just as human in its phenomenal imposition. This makes it a duty to have fun, sleep, and offer constructions that respect your subjects. A person who risks their life on a challenge are often those who are truly maximizing their quality of life and are living to the fullest. Rock climbing may be deemed immoral without this duty to freedom. So would the sport of football. This means that the Adam of Good is not something that imposes on you the best result, but rather something that liberates you to exercise your own agency, as the best result is also seeded from your own will. Thus, crimes against yourself are allowed by yourself, as you are the only one who can decide your own life in my interpretation of the Adam of Good. This allowance of self-harm is called pyrrhicism. This is only due to my raising in the United States of America that the duty to the mores sides with me on this. If I was in a different society, I might have an agent-based view of the duty to the mores and see these activities as not wronging yourself but wronging the agents of your life. This creates essentially responsibility to others as determined by the mores that allow for the culture of ELH that is respected from the seeds of history to take effect. I think this allows us to truly inspect the spectrum of allowed activity, some foolish but fun, some strict but dutiful, that make human life so varied and complex. Theories of good. A theory of good is the attempt of the good will to impose a solution when the definition and metaphysics of ELH cause there to be a spectrum of allowable activity. My example would be, should we torture cattle farmers for justice for the slaughter of cows? The theory of justice for anything that cannot understand the crime is done through the imposition of the theory of justice. I maintain that the most just activity is the theory of good that is metaphysically sound and results in the most measurable good. The theory of best practices is what we should consider to allow the best and most moral world. Thus, even if there is metaphysically justified torture, we still look to the most moral world as our aim. This is a learning morality and allows for us to see that the world is what we are constructing morally. The best theory of good for the justice for cattle is the theory which, when put in practice, results in the most good world. Then the policy we must take towards immoral eating practices is the policy that results in the world changing towards the construction of the moral space that allows us to eat morally, well, and with the best nutrition. This includes anything from forgiving cattle farmers for their slaughter to punishing them with jail time to paying them more to farm other crops or just to let the animals freely live on the farm. This knowledge of the fact that the most just world is not necessarily what we as humans consider good is the recognition of flaws in ourselves and our humanity. Systems of ethical hierarchy. The systems by which human, animal, and plant life are ranked are determined by this section. It is a system by which we see that ethical activity is compared to allow for a ranking of the best and worst of people. This system is often looked down upon as a way to justify slavery, moral righteousness, and all the abuses of a system that dehumanizes people and ranks them with a number. This is exactly what this section will try to repair. Ranking systems of animals and plants are often easy to do. Biology tells us what an animal will do with some certainty. Humans are variable and capable of both evil and good. Human life on principle should be respected more than animal or plant life. This is true due to any more of human wills. Pests are the life that harms others, be it human, plant, or animal. We in the modern world have eliminated many of the pests that plague the world through the use of conservation. This use of the logic of ethical conservation is exactly what is used to justify much of the horrors of the 20th century. From the Holocaust to Stalin's Russia, we see that this ethics of human conservation has influenced statecraft in a negative manner. This includes, but is not limited to, China's one-child policy and all that prevent people from living freely. We see that the first step to allow for ethical conservation is to limit the power of those who would impose this on society. We must recognize that the reason liberal democracy and people who have human rights is largely due to this rejection of this sort of ethics. How, if systems of perfect justice are imposed, do we prevent the abuses of this sort of thinking? This is a difficult problem for any philosopher, and much of the 20th century liberal order is dedicated to fighting this type of thinking at the highest level. Because of this, I'm opposed to instituting systems that only function to rank people. The only reason we would need a system of ethical hierarchy is to decide duty in role. The duty to the worst person and the best is still the same. We see this in ways to decide reward and to change behavior to allow for the best result in the social order. If I am a doctor and you are a sailor, we see that the ranking is almost always positive. The duty to subjects who are in the negative in terms of moral ranking is always justice and impositions by which we limit the harm that is inherent in the reason for the ranking. All human, plant, and animal life is valued in the calculus of the goodwill, and we must work to ensure that the adjudication of wills is also in the best interest of these things. The assumption of rank is that it allows special privileges. This is true of power and status without duty. With duty, it is simply the allowance of certain things to people who are more powerful, through Ben power, and are authorities when it comes to the practice of making good. This is demonstrated in the main tasks of social arrangements, the raising of children, and the extraction of work from adults. There are several strategies when we are raising children to allow for them to be safe, well-educated, or useful for the reproduction of the world. I will not go into each of these strategies or tell you which is the good wills. All subjects require other people to perform services that allow for their growth, safety, and a good result for themselves. This cooperation is the natural state of society to ensure that all prosper in a good-willed environment. All subjects are ruled in one way or another, children especially so. The parental figures make up the rules to educate children on the constraints of reality, the constraints of society, and the duty to others that must come about for the child to start realizing adulthood and self-sustainability. We never truly stop being raised by others. This is called growth, if it is positive, regression, if it is negative. This influence is something that adults shield from their children if they are trying to be good to them. The duty here is between the adults with wisdom and the children with agency to find the cooperative balance between the self and the world, a part to play in this grand show of real life. Adults often dread being adults as they are treated with the constraints that their parents may have liberated them from as children. These constraints mean that in order for social arrangements to come to being, then we must extract some benefit from the adult to repurpose for the rest of society. For some, this means work. For others, this means any activity that results in the maintenance of the civil society, government, or any culture that allows for the good of the world to be maintained. We see that the question of adulthood is not how can society do its duty to me, but rather how can I do the duty to society? Many societies have failed to do their duty to the adult subject, as they are often thrust into the world with the need to provide some good to the world, but a lack of experience or ability to provide that good fully. This is why there are whole systems by which adults are forced to provide for strangers in the world in order to gain wisdom and experience by which they go on to provide for the next generation. This is a very conservative, in the American sense, ideology, as it sees adults not as respected subjects but as tools of society to achieve the best result for those that either know better or don't know enough. This leads us to systems of ethical hierarchy that promote the best theory of good for all people. The young adults and the adults that must perform the social arrangement that is imposed on them. In democracy, this is also the retooling of the social arrangement for a new order to take effect. There are 4 places to be in a democratic society: siding with power and power siding with you, not siding with power and power siding with you, not siding with power and power siding against you, and siding with power and power siding against you. These four positions detail the duties that have failed or succeeded in the democratic society. The need then is to try to get as many people with power siding with them to promote the best result. When power sides against you, even if you side with power, this is where the problems of the world, at least in democracy, come about. Thus, we must use the power of honesty and clear vision to see how to remedy these two positions. The duty of power must be to always side with the individuals that aim to advance the cause of good. These are the leaders that allow all to prosper. If power sides against you, in a goodwill construction of society, it is usually about justice or wrong that you yourself have been doing. The only way to establish duty in democracy is through just conflict and theories of just conflict. We know what is right or wrong, but we don't know how to achieve it until we have the experience from leading or our leaders. Thus, the world must change, and we must change it if we are to promote good for ourselves, agents, and the world. Questions of power then become questions of merit, authority, and the earned recognition of the subject in the eyes of the world. The best of us are often limited by a lack of a civil society that allows people to construct a world that is better for themselves, according to their merit. The system of ethical hierarchy is a system which recognizes that the best arrangement of power is the arrangement that is both earned and taken away. The construction of those that rank people is the source of most corruption if any system should take effect that ranks people. Then there are two classes of people, the actors and the adjudicators. This is often seen as those who seek to better the world directly and those who provide the support for those that benefit the world directly. The construction of the adjudicators are often the people who gatekeep the systems of the world to prevent abuses and harms from those who are active in the world. This is the support structure of the government, business, and civil society. In civil society under freedom, we see that the world is adjudicated based on public relations and the perception of the individual. In government, the world is adjudicated by the justice system. In business, the world is adjudicated by those who invest for profit, and hopefully the justice system. The failure of the adjudication class is the failure of gatekeeping and preventing people who would do wrong to continue to do wrong. Civil society has often failed to prevent people from gaining power and influence to perform wrongdoing. But codified systems offer us the best prevention against corruption and wrongdoing. Most governments have whole systems to allow adjudication of those who would misuse power, as well as systems of law that prevent certain abuses. The problem then is what allows for certain mistakes, abuses, and immoral constructions of the will to take effect. I attribute this to a lack of consciousness of the good-willed individual, but there is much malice in the world. The systemic problems of the world are often caused by people who profit from them, and there is little an individual can do but raise consciousness. Thus, once problems are detailed, it takes power a certain amount of time to correct or be in the wrong simply for a lack of other options. These problems are then seen as a failure of power to solve problems unless the wills are there to make sure that these problems stay inherent in the system. The problems of freedom are solved through the restriction on freedom, but there are whole systems of wills that prevent the problems of freedom to be solved. Then, the only possible solution to the problems of freedom is through power siding with the solution to the problem, and this is done through a consciousness of the policy that solves, awareness of the problem and solution, and the political movement to allow for a solution to take hold in all areas of society. What is the proper way for us to adjudicate these problems and find these solutions to the problems of the world? Problems of Eleutherinian Hermenism. For the purpose of the chapter, I will assume an intuitive formulation for this example, ELH. This formulation is based on my own intuition. The actual problems of the world are innumerable, so take this chapter to be a practical primer in how ELH solves problems. An example of a moral problem: there is a well in the middle of town. It is technically on the property of a man. The man, thinking that he has property of the well, institutes a tax of $1 per bucket. The town immediately rebels and seizes the well from the man. This is the classic case of eminent domain. The man may own the property under the well and could, under the ethics of property, tax for its use. The town sees the well as communal property and thus can use force to defend this service. The man has acted under the maxim, seize a public good for the purpose of profit. For different formulations, it could conclude different things. My formulation would be because the man allowed the use of the well for free, he allows it to be a public good. If the man had built the well for the purpose of selling the water, I would allow the man to create a market and thus own the well. The man loses claim to the water because it is a public good just on his property, and unless there is need for this taxation, he is essentially abolishing a public good with no exchange that repairs the harm of this abolition. This process demonstrates the fundamental way Eleutherian Hermenists evaluate the history component of the goodwill. We ask, what is the man's duty based on history, and the components of moral phenomena that apply to this situation? Then we seek to use our own theory of good to achieve what we know is good based on this understanding. Theories of good must always have a consciousness of the best result, and the duty to the mores. Hopefully this example teaches us the process by which history is used in the moral adjudicatory calculus. The ethics of conservation are an interesting problem as it is our relationship to nature and wildlife. This means that if any dangerous creature or harmful organism is destroying the ecology of the natural world, it is our duty to prevent this harm. The calculus of hunting is essential, killing animals to further human or natural ends. If there is an invasive species or predator that poses a threat to humans or the natural balance of things, then it is moral and dutiful to do something about it. The threat to humans is respecting the ends of rational actors, and the threat to nature is respecting the ends of the world that all people inhabit. Clearly, environmental crime is still disrespecting the ends of rational beings as pollution makes the world less habitable. What of questions of greater good, such as polluting in order to power people's homes? This is moral as the human good is good, but rational actors would simply restructure society in such a way that promotes sustainable ecology. There is a duty to one's environment as disrespecting the world you live in disrespects your own and others' ends. On the trolley problem, Eleutherian Hermenism would propose the maxim, my right to not directly kill one person versus the rights of 5 people to live. You could also change the maxim to killing 5 people through inaction by not killing one person. Next, we weigh the cost of 1 innocent death with the cost of 5 innocent deaths. We would then evaluate the rights of the actor himself. Is he allowed to let 4 more innocents die just to avoid directly killing one? I would argue that the individual does not have that right. This means that we pull the lever. A lie in Kant's original interpretation is categorically immoral. How do Eleutherian improvements affect the state of the lie under deontology? The classic conflict of lies for the greater good asks, what value do we place on truth? This is essential when confronting these lies. The right to know is how I solve this problem. Does the person who we are talking to have the right to know the truth? Say a terrorist asks a general for the nuclear codes of America. It is obvious that the general does not have an obligation to disclose this information. This is also true for any information that is covered in the right to know. Do I harm them if I don't disclose this information? Do I stand in the way of justice if I fail to disclose this information? This all decides the person's right to know. The most moral thing to do when someone does not have the right to know would be to tell them you are not telling them. The right to know does not allow lying except in some cases. Take, for example, a murderer chasing your friend. You should not tell him where your friend is, but not giving him an answer may make yourself unsafe. Lying is justified under the grounds of the physical safety of your friend and yourself. This is what makes telling a lie moral. Lying is a tool that should be used only in certain cases to avoid harm. What if the truth causes harm? The telling of white lies to improve sociability, exercise tact, and use diplomacy can be allowed under ELH. Not telling an acquaintance that their outfit is terrible is justified under these values. This goes back to the mores of breaches. If it is not your place to tell someone something that is permissible. Honesty for honesty's sake is allowed, but so are preserving social spaces. The right to know is used judiciously and can account for respecting all of the principles of social mores. Lies that prevent moral justice, harm, and are used to take advantage of people through deceit are still immoral. Thus, lies are wavum. My process of Elhis judgment is seek results from the Hermenist calculus, Seek ways that do less harmful means for those results. Examine from higher order duties to see if that is what is causing the problem, and then make a judgment based on the cooperation, if possible, of both parties in disputes. Conclusion. There are as many moral problems in the world as there are people living in it. Take my own theory of good that has sprouted up from the act of writing this metaphysics, not as law but as a good start to forming your own. A problem of philosophy is that many can have a different interpretation of a work. I hope that my efforts allow for a clear and honest view of morality, as this is what I hope you take from this work. That only comes from a deep reading of this work and practicing moral issues, as this metaphysics can only provide the philosophical basis for the aims of identifying what is right and wrong. The aim of this book is to provide a metaphysics that is the interaction between guide and judge morality. It aims to connect all systems of honest ethical thought into one metaphysics and allow us to see morality clearly. This does not make the most difficult questions of morality easier. It simply hopes to be the metaphysical solution to our understanding of these problems. One sees that this work feels rather incomplete without the aid of a deep reading of the imposition of this metaphysics on the world. I do not aim to answer and codify all moral problems, but simply offer a metaphysics that allows a moral understanding at the very least, and a solution at the very best.